Du Fu at the grave of Grand Marshal Fang. Once again on my way to another district, I halt my horse at your lonely grave to say farewell. Recent tears have left no dry soil. The low sky still heavy with broken clouds. I used to sit at the go-board with Grand Tutor Xie. Now I am Jia, holding his sword above Shu Lord's grave. Nothing to see now but the blossoms falling in the wood. Nothing to hear but the oriole's song lingering in my ear as I leave. So here we have another of Du Fu's pentasyllabic regulated poems, and as we've been mentioning lately, the poems seem to be ordered chronologically, more or less. So the poem we're reading today is a poem that was written around the year 762, I believe, and it's a poem, as the title says, it's a funerary poem, a homage, a remembrance of this departed friend, who was also probably Du Fu's most important patron whilst he lived. So who is this Grand Marshal Fang? So Grand Marshal Fang was a relatively important politician during 3 reigns. He started service under Xuanzong, and he generally, for most of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, didn't manage to get very important positions until the very last year, the year of the Anlushan Rebellion. The Marshal, through this figure Fang, through a show of loyalty to the emperor, while he was going away to Shu, promoted Fang Wang to the position of virtually prime minister. But as you know, we've already talked about this, while he was traveling, the emperor decided, shortly after arriving to Shu, that he would have to abdicate, and he sent, with the imperial seal, Fang Wang to his son, who became the next emperor, Suzong. Now, Suzong favored for a time Marshal Fang, but after a few years, whether for valid or reasons or just for other obscure reasons, he was demoted. He managed just at the end of his life, at the beginning of the next emperor's reign, Emperor Daizong, he managed to be posted as Minister of Justice, but didn't manage to get to the capital before dying. So, as I said, Fang Guang was one of the patrons, while he was alive, of Du Fu. So, Du Fu's fortunes waxed and waned as Marshal Fang's fortunes waxed and waned. When he was exiled to the provinces, which was in the year 758, I believe, was exactly when Du Fu was sent to his minor office at Huazhou. So this poem, we've already mentioned the topic. The topic is a lament at the death of this friend and patron for Du Fu, his best patron, in fact. So Du Fu is passing by next to the Grand Marshal's grave. He goes, he visits it, he writes a poem to reminisce, to make a homage to the Grand Marshal at his tomb. And so minor subtopics, loyalty to a friend, even in times of adversity, the merit, the virtue of the deceased. And that is very well represented in the poem through 2 historical examples that Du Fu quotes that we will comment when we get to that couplet. Also the sadness of the scene, the poignancy of seeing a friend's grave, and the natural surroundings act as a sub-theme. Okay, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet as usual. First couplet. Once again on my way to another district, I halt my horse at your lonely grave to say farewell. So you will remember that from the 60s onward, Du Fu was almost always on the move, searching for a patron, finding for 5 years some patronage and protection in Shu under Jiang Wu, who had been a subordinate of Marshal Fang. Then traveling onwards and onwards, going basically down the Jiangsu River Valley. So Du Fu is moving from here to there. He passes close to the grave of his old benefactor, and he decides to visit it and say goodbye to his old friend. Second couplet, which is the first parallelistic couplet, it describes the scene at the grave. Just as the first couplet was an introduction to the topic along with the title, in the second one, what can be seen at the graveyard? Recent tears have left no dry soil. The low sky heavy with broken clouds. So here we get a typical example of the pathetic fallacy, which we've talked about many times. You know, the idea that nature is moved by human events or by human suffering or by human death. So at the cemetery or at the burial, at the grave of Marshal Fang, we have, this melancholy sight. Recent tears have left no dry soil. So the soil is wet, dripping. One way of interpreting this verse is that the poet is equating the rains that are falling over the grave as the tears of heaven for the death of this nobleman. Another way of interpreting it could be that perhaps so many people lament the death of Grand Marshal Fang that with their tears they've made the soil around his tomb wet. Anyway, the sky is also heavy with broken clouds, so that seems to point in the direction of the recent rains having fallen and of the association with heavenly rain and human rain, with nature reacting to the death of the Marshal with rains or with tears of its own. So the next couplet is a reminiscence of Du Fu, remembering the time he spent with Marshal Fang, and he quotes two historical examples, two figures to equate to Marshal Fang. I used to sit at the Go board with Grand Tutor Xie. Now I am Zhizha, holding his sword above the Shu Lord's grave. So this needs a lot of explanation. So the first line, the first comparison, is a comparison of Grand Marshal Fang with a historical figure, the Grand Tutor Xie. The second line has a double comparison of Du Fu with an ancient figure from the spring and autumns, Zhizha, and the deceased Grand Marshal with a figure that was related to Zhizha, the Lord of Shu. So let's explain the anecdotes very briefly. The first one, Grand Tutor Xian, was the Chancellor Prime Minister of the Eastern Jin dynasty, and there is a celebrated anecdote about him. When his brothers were fighting against the northern barbarians, he was playing a game of what the Japanese call Go, the Chinese Wei Qi, it's a board game, and it was a momentous Chinese victory, and when the messengers came to tell the tutor Xie of the victory, he pretended, he had a great deal of self-control, and, he pretended, not to be too moved by the circumstances. Although later when he went into his room, he was, so really excited that he broke his shoes without noticing them by banging them against the step into his bedroom. And there is another anecdote with him. Just before the battle, one of his nephews or brothers, who was destined to the front and who was a very good Go player, played a Go game with tutor Xie, and he lost, even though he was the better player, because he was nervous. So the image, therefore, is the image that Du Fu is painting for us is, Marshal Fang is like Grand Tutor Xie, a chancellor, a very important politician who has been able to always keep composed and self-controlled, a master of himself, not heart mastered, but heart's master. So perhaps Du Fu did play chess with Grand Marshal Fang in the past, but in evoking those games they played together, he is equating him with, the ideal exemplar of one of the best chancellors in Chinese history. The second example, so Jia was a member of the royal family of the state of Wu, I believe. And once he made a visit to the central states of China, and he was carrying a beautiful sword. The blacksmiths of Wu and Jue were reputed for making wonderful swords. And he visited a small lord, the Lord of Shu, who liked very much the sword that Jia was carrying. So Jia decided that he was going to give the sword as a gift to the Lord of Shu, but he had to go away on other business. And when he came back, the Lord of Shu had died. So he, as a homage, as a gift, as the gift he could not give when the Lord of Shu was alive, he hung the sword from a tree next to the Lord of Shu's tomb. So in this example, in the second couplet, therefore, Du Fu is saying, I haven't been able to repay you when you were alive. I am repaying you with this poem now that you're dead, just as Ji Zhan repaid, gave the gift of his sword. I give the gift of my words to you, my deceased friend and lord. So, this couplet represents both the idealization of Grand Tutor Xie, and therefore of Marshal Fang, and also the homage that Du Fu wants to make after death to the Marshal through his gift, which is not a sword. It's these 8 lines of verse. Last couplet. And the last couplet takes us again to the sensory impressions around the tomb of Marshal Fang. So it takes us in line to the second couplet, which was also describing nature's pathos surrounding the tomb. Nothing to see now but the blossoms falling in the wood. Nothing to hear but the oriole's song lingering in my ear as I leave. So 2 melancholy sounds and sights close the poem, a visual and an oral. Falling flowers in the forest, disappearing sound of the oriole's chirping as Du Fu is leaving. These sad sounds act as a visual and oral chorus to the general sadness of the poem, of visiting the tomb, of lamenting the wise, the good Marshal that has gone away. And it's a loss that's, as very typical in Du Fu, there is a juxtaposition of personal loss and national loss. Probably Du Fu sincerely believes that Grand Marshal Fang was a great man and his loss, a great loss for the nation. But from a more chromatistical point of view, he sees the disappearance, the death of Grand Marshal Fang as the loss of his best patron and the one who had the greatest possibility of advancing his own career and prospects.